Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to my 3 Takeaways episode from the Dr. Dennis Jaffe interview that I released this past Monday. That was such a unique topic to be able to discuss on a podcast. I feel like a lot of people on podcasts discuss family things, discuss business things, but very rarely do I hear podcasts that are the combination of the two about family businesses. And it's really important because the aspects that make a family special and unique and thriving are one thing. Business can be another thing, but then when you combine the two, it's a whole other animal that's really hard to tackle, and it's really a unique topic to study about, and he's dedicated a large portion of his life to really studying it and seeing what really allows family businesses to be successful and to move from one generation to the next and not drop off and only continue to grow and continue to be more and more successful. So make sure you go back and listen to that episode because it really is telling as to what families need to be doing in order to bring the next generation along and allow them to be successful in a similar manner that they were successful in, but how they get there is going to be a little bit differently. So let's go ahead and get right into my 3 takeaways from this episode. Takeaway number 1 is cross-generational engagement. It's really important how the first generation that starts a business has a really good idea of the business because they grew it to a certain point, but then the next generation is going to have different problems that they have to solve. So the older generation has to be willing to be humble and ask the generation for help and for guidance and to be willing to learn from them. I think a lot of times we are not willing to be humble. We don't let ourselves have humility when we're talking to people who are younger than us because we feel like they're just young, they're just naive, which in a lot of instances, people who are young, are naive, are ignorant. But in some instances, they're great learning opportunities, people who have a fresh perspective on things. And that was one of the biggest things for family businesses, to be able to move from one generation to a next successfully and to engage the younger generation. You have to be willing to ask them about certain things and be willing to learn from them in order to kind of grow and develop that business. And that also allows the younger generation to be willing to take on responsibility because they don't want to just be told what to do. But if they're empowered by those above them, then they're more willing to be engaged with that business and be more likely to take it over and grow it in the future. So cross-generational engagement. Takeaway number 2 was continual value creation. And that's something that is a little bit similar to the cross-generational engagement, but the way it's different is that each generation has to bring their own value. And when he was talking about this, I really thought of the Vince Dooley episode from a few episodes back now. So what he said is, the younger generations need to embrace what's already there as the business. They need to embrace the history of it. They need to embrace the way that the older generations have brought it up. But once you embrace that, you have to bring your own value to the business. You have to create your own value. And you can do that by making sure that you go to school. You can do that by making sure that you build your own skills, you build your own knowledge and that sort of thing. But in order to have a successful long-term family business, you can't just be doing the same thing generation after generation after generation. Each generation needs to bring its own unique value to that business in order for it to continue to thrive at the highest level. And he talks about how G1, generation 1 starts and builds the business. Generation 2 can take it nationwide or take it global. A lot of times generation 3 buys other businesses and increases their portfolio and that sort of a thing. And like I mentioned Vince Dooley. He talked about how he went to University of Georgia. He had to embrace the history of UGA and then embrace everything that got it to where it is today. But then he wanted to add on top of that and bring his own value to it. So continual value creation. And then takeaway number 3 was family businesses set expectations and policies. Over and over again in these interviews, I hear the importance of setting expectations as a leader. You have to be willing to be courageous enough to lay out the expectations. I think a lot of us aren't willing to lay out what we expect of others, and we don't lay out the policies that others should abide by. And why it's really important with family businesses is they lay out expectations, and if the people in the younger generations or just within their family of the same generation, if they don't meet that expectation, then there's not going to get certain rewards because of it. And the reason that it's so important to lay it out ahead of time is because if somebody knows the expectation and they come up short of it, then the lack of reward or whatever comes from them coming up short of that expectation will simply be because they came up short of the expectation. They're not going to look at it as something that's just unfair. Now, maybe on the front end, they can say the expectation is unfair, but if they agree to the expectation and then come up short, they can't look at the other person and say they're being unfair. They can look at themselves and take responsibility for it and say, I just didn't live up to the expectation. So those three things, really important. So again, 3 takeaways. Number 1, cross-generational engagement. Make sure you're willing to learn from the younger generations and be willing to go to that place of humility. Takeaway 2 was continual value creation. In order for a business to sustain generation to generation, each generation needs to bring its own uniqueness, needs to bring its own value. And then takeaway number 3 was family businesses set expectations and policies. And this is for all leadership. We need to be able to set expectations so that if someone doesn't live up to it, then they're either punished or they don't get the reward because of that, not just because you're being an unjust or unfair leader that a lot of people claim that you would potentially be. I hope you guys enjoyed these 3 takeaways. I hope you got something from these 3 takeaways. I hope it maybe inspires you to go to a place of humility and ask somebody else for a little bit of value. I hope it gives you some humility to go to ask somebody else, how can you bring value to what we're trying to build right here if you're in a business, if you're part of a team or a part of a group. I just hope you guys are hanging in there during this time of quarantine. I know it can be a little bit of tough, but I hope you're finding a way to be creative and find a way to be unique during this challenging time, because that's what it's all about. When we're faced with these difficult times, it's all about trying to reinvent yourself and trying to find a way to stand out and create something that can be of value to others. I hope you guys are doing great. I hope you enjoyed these 3 takeaways. Make sure you share it with a friend. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Make sure you rate and review it, all those things. I hope something in this episode allows you to get closer and closer to your best you.